Listen carefully, France. I just expelled your troops from Burkina Faso and replaced them with Russian mercenaries, and from the ashes of your colonial military bases rises African sovereignty you can never reclaim. You thought we'd beg forever for your protection while you exploited our resources and controlled our politics. You believed French soldiers on our soil meant permanent French dominance over Burkina Faso. You were catastrophically wrong. I negotiated secret deal with Putin's Wagner forces. I kicked out every French soldier. I invited Russian mercenaries who don't lecture us about democracy while supporting dictators. Your military empire in West Africa collapsed. Your influence shattered. Your century of control ended. This is your final warning to every French base, every French soldier, every French interest, bleeding profit from Africa. Leave now, or watch us replace you, country by country, until France has zero military presence on our continent. We choose our own security partners now. Try to punish us, and all 54 African nations expel French forces simultaneously. Africa's liberation from your military occupation is permanent. Your era ended the day I signed with Russia. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I became president of Burkina Faso through military coup, not elections. I won't pretend otherwise. On the 24th of January 2022, I led military officers who seized power from President Rochmark, Christian Caboret, who had failed catastrophically to address the jihadist insurgencies destroying our country. Burkina Faso was being overrun by militants linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Thousands of our citizens were dying. Millions were displaced. Nearly half our territory was outside government control, and France, our supposed security partner for decades, was doing nothing effective to stop it. French troops had been in Burkina Faso for years, part of broader operations across the Sahel region, including Operations Serval and Barkhane. France claimed these forces were fighting jihadism and protecting African populations. The reality was different. French military presence served French interests, not Burkinabe interests. French bases provided France with strategic positioning in West Africa. French operations gave France leverage over African governments. French troops protected French economic interests, particularly uranium mines in Niger and other resources France needed. African security was secondary. I watched this for years before taking power. I saw French forces conduct operations that killed civilians. I saw French intelligence that seemed more focused on monitoring African governments than fighting jihadists. I saw French military aid that came with conditions undermining our sovereignty. I saw French troops living in comfortable bases, while Burkinabe soldiers died fighting insurgents with inadequate equipment. The relationship was neo-colonial, not partnership. France treated Burkina Faso as subordinate territory, not sovereign nation. When I took power, I inherited this French military presence and the failure it represented. Jihadist violence was accelerating despite years of French operations. The insurgents controlled more territory than when French forces arrived. Our population was losing faith in the government's ability to provide security. Something had to change fundamentally, not incrementally. I began evaluating alternatives to French security partnership, and that evaluation led me to Russia. The initial contact with Russian representatives happened quietly through intermediaries in early 2022, just weeks after I took power. I sent trusted officers to meet with Russian military and intelligence officials to discuss potential cooperation. The conversations were exploratory, feeling out whether Russia would be willing to replace French forces and what they would demand in exchange. The Russian response was immediate interest. They saw opportunity to displace French influence in West Africa and gain strategic foothold in a region they'd been largely absent from since the Cold War ended. The negotiations were conducted in absolute secrecy because we knew if France discovered our plans before we were ready to act, they would sabotage everything. French intelligence was extensive in Burkina Faso after decades of presence. They had informants throughout our government and military. Keeping the Russian negotiations secret required extreme operational security. Only my closest allies knew what we were planning. We used encrypted communications. We met in locations where French surveillance couldn't penetrate. We built the entire framework for replacing French forces with Russian mercenaries before France had any idea what was coming. The Russian representatives I dealt with weren't official government diplomats. They were connected to Wagner Group, the private military company that had operated in Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, and other conflict zones. Wagner wasn't officially part of the Russian government, though everyone understood it operated with Kremlin approval and support. Using Wagner rather than official Russian military forces gave both sides deniability. Russia could claim it wasn't directly intervening in Burkina Faso. I could claim I was hiring private security contractors, not inviting foreign military forces. The Wagner negotiators were professional and direct. They didn't lecture me about democracy, human rights, or governance like French and Western officials constantly did. They didn't impose conditions about how I ran Burkina Faso or demand political reforms in exchange for security support. They asked what I needed, stated what they could provide, and negotiated what they wanted in return. The transactional clarity was refreshing after years of French moralizing that masked continued exploitation. I told them what Burkina Faso needed: immediate military support to fight jihadist insurgencies that were overwhelming our forces, training for Burkinabe soldiers in counterinsurgency tactics and operations, intelligence on militant networks and operations, advanced weapons and equipment our military lacked, advisors embedded with our units to improve operational effectiveness, helicopter support for mobility and firepower. The shopping list was extensive because French support had been inadequate for years despite France claiming to be our security partner. The Wagner representatives explained what they could provide. Between 300 to 400 Wagner fighters would deploy to Burkina Faso initially, with capability to increase numbers if necessary. These weren't raw recruits, they were experienced combat veterans who had fought in Syria, Ukraine, and across Africa. They would conduct direct combat operations against jihadist forces, not just train and advise. They would bring their own weapons, equipment, and logistics. They would embed advisors with Burkinabe military units. They would provide intelligence gathered through their networks across the Sahel. They would supply advanced weapons, including drones, night vision equipment, and communications gear. Then came the discussion of what Russia wanted in return. This is where the deal's real nature became clear. Wagner wanted payment, but not primarily in cash. They wanted access to Burkina Faso's gold mining sector. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's largest gold producers, extracting approximately 60 tons annually, worth over $3 billion. Wagner representatives wanted mining concessions that would give them rights to extract gold from specific sites. They also wanted military basing rights, allowing them to establish permanent facilities in Burkina Faso that could support operations across West Africa. Finally, they wanted political alignment, expecting Burkina Faso to support Russian positions in international forums and reduce cooperation with France and Western powers. I calculated whether this deal served Burkina Faso's interests. The alternative was continuing with French forces that had failed to stop jihadist violence despite years of operations. French support came with constant criticism of my government and pressure for political reforms I wasn't willing to implement. French presence meant continued subordination to former colonial power. Wagner offered immediate military effectiveness without governance conditions. Yes, they wanted gold mining access, but French companies and Western interests had been extracting Burkinabe resources for decades. At least Wagner was honest about the exchange rather than pretending it was aid or partnership. I decided the deal was worth it. Burkina Faso would trade gold mining concessions and basing rights to Russia in exchange for effective military support against jihadists and liberation from French influence. The security situation was desperate enough that I needed immediate, effective help, not gradual improvement from reluctant French forces. The political situation was clear enough that breaking from France would be popular domestically regardless of who replaced them. The strategic calculation favored accepting Wagner's terms. We finalized the secret agreement in mid-2022. Wagner would deploy forces to Burkina Faso within 60 days. They would receive mining concessions at 3 major gold sites, generating estimated $200 million annually in revenue for Wagner-connected companies. They would get basing rights at 2 locations in northern Burkina Faso near the borders with Mali and Niger, positioning them to operate across the region. In exchange, Wagner would provide immediate counterinsurgency support, training for Burkinabe forces, intelligence, equipment, and advisors. The deal was for 5 years, initially, with automatic renewal, unless either side withdrew. With the Russian deal secured, I began planning how to expel French forces. This required careful orchestration because France would resist and try to maintain presence through diplomatic pressure. I needed to create political conditions that made French departure inevitable while preventing them from sabotaging the transition or punishing Burkina Faso economically. I started building public sentiment against French presence through media campaigns and public statements criticizing French military operations. I highlighted civilian casualties from French airstrikes. I questioned why jihadist violence was increasing despite years of French intervention. I reminded Burkinabe citizens about colonial history and France's continued interference in African affairs. The anti-French messaging resonated because people were frustrated with insecurity and angry about France's historical exploitation. Public protests against French presence emerged, some organized by my supporters, others genuinely spontaneous. Demonstrators gathered outside French bases demanding troops leave. They burned French flags and chanted anti-colonial slogans. The protests created political pressure and visual evidence that Burkinabe population rejected French military presence. This gave me popular mandate to demand French withdrawal. I coordinated with Mali's military government, which had already expelled French forces months earlier, and invited Wagner. Mali's president and I aligned our messaging and actions, presenting united West African front against French military presence. The coordination strengthened both our positions by showing this wasn't an isolated incident but regional movement rejecting French influence. On the 20th of January 2023, I formally notified France that the 1961 military cooperation agreement between our countries was terminated. I gave France 1 month to withdraw all military forces from Burkina Faso. The announcement shocked French officials who hadn't anticipated such direct action. They scrambled to understand what was happening and how to respond. The French reaction combined fury, threats, and attempted negotiation. French president called me directly, demanding explanation and trying to convince me to reverse the decision. I told him bluntly that Burkina Faso was a sovereign nation choosing its own security partners, and we no longer wanted French troops on our soil. French Foreign Ministry issued statements warning about consequences for regional security. French Defense Ministry claimed that expelling French forces would create vacuum that jihadists would exploit. French intelligence warned about Russian intentions and Wagner's record of human rights abuses. I ignored all the French pressure because I knew they had no leverage. They couldn't force Burkina Faso to accept their military presence against our will without admitting they were occupying power, not partner. They couldn't punish us economically without proving they had been exploiting us all along. They couldn't stay without our cooperation because their bases required our support for supplies, logistics, and local security. The French discovered that decades of military presence had created illusion of control that evaporated the moment the host government withdrew consent. French troops began withdrawing in early February 2023. Approximately 400 French soldiers who had been stationed in Burkina Faso packed their equipment and prepared to leave. The withdrawal was humiliating for France because it happened under pressure and without dignity. French soldiers didn't leave as victorious partners completing a successful mission. They left as expelled forces whose presence had been rejected. The images of French convoys departing while Burkinabe citizens celebrated were broadcast internationally, demonstrating the collapse of French influence. Mandatory rehook at 3,000 words. Listen carefully, France. Your soldiers are gone from Burkina Faso, and in their place stand Russian mercenaries who don't pretend to respect us while exploiting us. You thought military bases and cooperation agreements meant permanent control. You believed we'd never have courage to expel you. You were humiliated completely. I terminated your 1961 military agreement. I gave you 30 days to leave. I replaced 400 French troops with Wagner fighters who actually fight instead of occupying comfortable bases. Your decades of dominance ended in 1 month. Your influence collapsed. Your warnings failed. This is your escalating final warning. Mali expelled you. Burkina Faso expelled you. Niger will expel you. Every French soldier in West Africa faces the same fate unless you leave voluntarily now. We partnered with Russia because they offer weapons without lectures, support without conditions, and respect without colonialism. Interfere with our Russian partnership and watch Wagner forces expand across every former French colony simultaneously. Try sanctions and we'll nationalize every French company on our soil. Africa chose new security partners. Your military occupation of our continent ended forever. Accept it or face total expulsion across all 54 nations. As French forces withdrew, Wagner mercenaries began arriving quietly in February 2023. The first contingent was approximately 100 fighters who flew into Ouagadougou on unmarked cargo planes. They weren't wearing Russian military uniforms or Wagner insignia publicly. They dressed in civilian clothes or plain military fatigues without identifying markers. The low profile was intentional because both Russia and I wanted to avoid giving Western media easy propaganda images of Russian mercenaries replacing Western troops. The Wagner fighters who arrived were hardened combat veterans, not raw recruits. Many had fought in Syria supporting Assad's government against rebels. Others had operated in Libya during the civil war there. Some had been in Central African Republic protecting the government and securing mining operations. A few had fought in Ukraine before deploying to Africa. These weren't peacekeepers or trainers. They were killers, comfortable with brutal violence and ambiguous rules of engagement. I met with the Wagner commander, a Russian veteran named Sergei who had operated in Syria and Central African Republic. He was direct about what Wagner would and wouldn't do. Wagner would conduct offensive operations against jihadist forces, not just defensive protection. They would embed advisors with Burkina Faso military units to improve their effectiveness. They would provide intelligence on militant networks gathered through interrogations and local sources. They would supply advanced equipment, including drones for surveillance and targeting. But Wagner wouldn't answer to my government or follow Burkina Faso military chain of command. They operated independently with their own command structure, reporting to Wagner leadership in Russia, not to me. This independence was concerning because it meant I couldn't fully control Wagner's actions on Burkina Faso soil. But it was also necessary because Wagner's effectiveness came partly from their willingness to use methods that regular militaries couldn't officially employ. Wagner didn't worry about human rights monitoring, rules of engagement, or international humanitarian law. They killed suspected jihadists and anyone supporting them without the constraints that limited French operations. That ruthlessness made them more effective at creating fear among insurgents, even if it also created risks of civilian casualties and abuses. Wagner established two main bases in northern Burkina Faso near Djibo and Dori, areas heavily affected by jihadist activity. These bases became operational headquarters for Wagner operations across the region. They built fortified compounds with heavy weapons, communications equipment, and accommodations for fighters. They established supply chains, bringing equipment and ammunition from Russia through allied African countries. They recruited local informants who provided intelligence on jihadist movements and hideouts. The infrastructure created permanent Wagner presence rather than temporary deployment. The gold mining concessions I had granted to Wagner-connected Russian companies began operating almost immediately. Russian mining executives arrived to assess sites and begin extraction operations. They brought equipment, hired local workers, and started producing gold that would be exported to Russia. The mining operations were separate from Wagner military activities officially, but everyone understood the connection. The gold revenue funded Wagner operations in Burkina Faso and across Africa, while providing profits for Russian companies and individuals close to Putin. Wagner began combat operations in March 2023, just weeks after arriving. Their first major action was assault on jihadist position near Djibo that had been harassing Burkina Faso forces for months. Wagner used drones to identify the militant camp, then attacked with helicopter gunships and ground forces. The assault was brutal and effective. Wagner killed dozens of suspected militants, destroyed their base, and seized weapons and supplies. They took no prisoners. Anyone identified as jihadist was killed on sight. The operation demonstrated Wagner's willingness to use maximum force without concern for proportionality or civilian presence. Burkina Faso military forces who worked with Wagner reported mixed reactions. Some appreciated Wagner's effectiveness and willingness to fight aggressively rather than conducting cautious operations like French forces had. Wagner brought immediate results through violent action that French forces avoided. Other Burkina Faso officers were disturbed by Wagner's methods, particularly treatment of prisoners and civilians in areas where jihadists operated. Wagner's approach was collective punishment in regions where insurgents had support. They didn't carefully distinguish between active militants and civilian populations that might be sympathetic or coerced. The intelligence Wagner provided came through brutal interrogation methods that French forces wouldn't officially employ. Suspected jihadists or collaborators were detained and interrogated using torture. The interrogations produced intelligence on militant networks, supply routes, leadership structures, and planned operations. Some of this intelligence was accurate and valuable for targeting actual threats. Some was false confessions extracted through torture from people who would say anything to stop the pain. Wagner didn't particularly care about distinguishing accurate from coerced intelligence. They acted on everything and used excessive force to ensure threats were eliminated, even if some targets were innocent. Wagner also trained Burkina Faso forces in their methods, embedding advisors with our military units. The training focused on aggressive tactics, maximum use of firepower, and willingness to accept civilian casualties as inevitable in counterinsurgency. Wagner advisors taught Burkinabe soldiers to shoot first and question later when encountering potential threats. They trained in ambush tactics, night operations, and using fear as weapon against populations that might support insurgents. The training made Burkinabe forces more aggressive and effective at killing militants, but also more likely to commit human rights abuses against civilians. By mid-2023, Wagner had approximately 300 fighters operating in Burkina Faso, with plans to increase to 400. They were conducting regular operations against jihadist groups, training Burkinabe forces, gathering intelligence, and securing the gold mining operations that funded their presence. The impact on security was mixed. In areas where Wagner operated with overwhelming force, jihadist activity decreased because militants were killed or fled. But overall, violence increased because Wagner's brutal methods provoked retaliation from insurgents and alienated civilians who might have otherwise opposed militants. Human rights organizations began documenting abuses by Wagner forces and Burkinabe troops working with them. Human Rights Watch reported mass killings of civilians accused of supporting jihadists without evidence or trials. Amnesty International documented torture of detainees and extrajudicial executions. The United Nations expressed concern about deteriorating human rights situation in Burkina Faso under the new security approach. Western governments condemned Wagner's presence and the abuses associated with their operations. I dismissed all the Western criticism as hypocritical interference. France had conducted operations in Burkina Faso that killed civilians for years without achieving security. The United States had supported counter-terrorism operations across the Sahel that involved human rights abuses by partner forces. Western countries had no moral authority to lecture Burkina Faso about methods when they had supported brutal regimes and operations throughout Africa for decades. Wagner's abuses weren't worse than what Western partners had enabled. They were just more honest about using violence without pretending to respect human rights. The relationship with Wagner was working from my perspective because it achieved my primary objectives. French forces were gone, ending direct French military presence in Burkina Faso. Jihadist violence was being confronted with aggressive force, rather than cautious operations that protected French soldiers more than Burkinabe civilians. Burkina Faso was demonstrating independence from France and Western powers by choosing Russian partner. The political message was clear. African nations could reject Western security partnerships and survive, even thrive, with alternatives. France watched Wagner's operations in Burkina Faso with alarm because they understood the implications. If Wagner succeeded in replacing French forces without catastrophic security collapse, other African countries would follow Burkina Faso's example. French military presence across West Africa, already reduced after expulsion from Mali, could disappear entirely. French economic interests protected by military presence would become vulnerable. French political influence tied to security partnerships would evaporate. Wagner in Burkina Faso threatened the entire system of French influence across Francophone Africa. French officials began warning about Wagner's record elsewhere in Africa. They highlighted abuses in Central African Republic, where Wagner forces had committed massacres of civilians. They documented Wagner's role in Libya supporting warlord Khalifa Haftar's brutal campaign against the internationally recognized government. They revealed Wagner's resource extraction operations that enriched Russian companies while providing minimal benefit to African populations. The French messaging tried to convince Africans that Wagner was worse alternative to French presence. But the French warnings failed because they came from source with no credibility after decades of exploitation. When France warned about Wagner extracting African resources, Africans remembered that French companies had been extracting our resources for over a century. When France condemned Wagner human rights abuses, Africans recalled French colonial atrocities and France's support for African dictators. When France claimed Wagner destabilized African countries, Africans noted that French military interventions had often made situations worse while serving French interests. France had lost moral authority to criticize Wagner because French behavior had been equally bad for far longer. The United States also expressed concern about Wagner in Burkina Faso, viewing it as part of broader Russian expansion in Africa that threatened American interests. The U.S. Africa Command warned that Wagner presence complicated American counterterrorism operations in the Sahel. State Department officials condemned Wagner's human rights record and called on Burkina Faso to reconsider the relationship. Treasury Department threatened sanctions against individuals involved in facilitating Wagner operations. I ignored American pressure just as I had ignored French warnings. The United States had minimal credibility to lecture about security partnerships after decades of supporting brutal regimes across Africa when convenient for American interests. American counterterrorism operations had killed civilians through drone strikes and raids. American military aid had equipped forces that committed human rights abuses. America's concern about Wagner wasn't about African welfare. It was about great power competition and preventing Russian influence from displacing American presence. I wasn't going to subordinate Burkina Faso's interests to American geopolitical preferences. By late 2023, Wagner's presence in Burkina Faso was consolidated and expanding. The initial 300 to 400 fighters were reinforced by additional personnel and equipment. Wagner was operating across northern and eastern Burkina Faso in areas with heavy jihadist presence. They had established command relationships with Burkinabe military forces. The gold mining operations were producing revenue-funding Wagner activities. The bases were permanent fixtures integrated into Burkina Faso's security infrastructure. The security results were mixed and controversial. Jihadist violence continued despite Wagner operations, though possibly at lower levels than would have occurred without their presence. Civilian casualties increased, both from jihadist attacks and from Wagner counterinsurgency operations. Hundreds of thousands of Burkinabe remained displaced from their homes due to insecurity. The humanitarian situation deteriorated as violence disrupted agriculture and closed schools and health facilities. Wagner's presence hadn't solved Burkina Faso's security crisis, but it had changed the dynamics and demonstrated alternatives to Western security partnerships. The political results were clearer. Burkina Faso had successfully expelled French forces and replaced them with Russian mercenaries, demonstrating that African countries could reject Western military presence. I had consolidated power domestically by delivering on promise to end French influence. Burkina Faso had aligned with Russia, China, and other non-Western powers, diversifying partnerships and reducing dependence on former colonial powers. The sovereignty narrative resonated domestically and across Africa, positioning me as leader willing to challenge Western dominance. Niger followed Burkina Faso's example in July 2023, when military officers overthrew the pro-Western government and expelled French forces. Niger's new military leaders invited Wagner to provide security support similar to what we had in Burkina Faso. The pattern was becoming clear. Military governments across the Sahel were rejecting French military presence and turning to Russia. France was losing its military foothold in West Africa, the region it had dominated since colonial times. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed an informal alliance of military-ruled Sahel countries aligned against France and toward Russia. We coordinated our messaging, supported each other against Western pressure, and worked with Russia on security cooperation. The alliance of Sahel states represented fundamental challenge to French influence and Western dominance in West Africa. We were demonstrating that African countries could organize collective resistance to Western powers and build alternative partnerships. France was losing not just military bases, but the entire system of influence those bases supported. French companies faced increasing hostility and threats to their operations. French diplomats found their influence over African governments dramatically reduced. French currency, the CFA franc used across Francophone West Africa, faced growing opposition from countries that resented French control over monetary policy. France's position as primary external power in West Africa was collapsing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The United States and European countries faced difficult decisions about how to respond. They couldn't force African countries to accept Western military presence against their will without proving they were occupying powers rather than partners. They couldn't compete militarily with Wagner without matching Wagner's willingness to ignore human rights, which democratic governments faced domestic pressure not to do. They couldn't offer the same no-strings-attached partnership that Russia provided without abandoning the governance conditions and human rights standards that were politically important to Western voters. The dilemma revealed fundamental contradictions in Western approaches to Africa. For decades, Western powers had claimed to support African democracy, human rights, and good governance, while simultaneously maintaining relationships with authoritarian regimes when convenient for Western interests. France had supported dictators across Francophone Africa throughout the post-independence period when those dictators served French economic and strategic interests. The United States had backed brutal regimes during the Cold War and after when they aligned with American counterterrorism or other objectives. Western moral authority to criticize African governments for partnering with Wagner was undermined by this history of selective application of democratic principles. Western powers also faced the reality that they had failed to deliver security in the Sahel despite years of military presence and billions in security assistance. French Operation Barkhane had deployed thousands of troops across the region for nearly a decade without defeating jihadist insurgencies. American security assistance programs had trained and equipped Sahelian militaries that then proved ineffective against militants and sometimes committed human rights abuses. Western counterterrorism approaches focused on killing militant leaders and disrupting networks hadn't addressed the underlying governance failures, economic marginalization, and political grievances that fueled insurgencies. When African governments concluded that Western security partnerships weren't working, Western powers had no compelling argument that more of the same approach would produce different results. The economic dimension complicated Western responses further. France had extensive economic interests across West Africa that military presence had historically protected. French companies dominated telecommunications, banking, energy, and other sectors in former French colonies. The CFA franc currency system tied 14 West and Central African countries' monetary policies to France and required them to deposit reserves in French treasury. French development assistance and trade relationships created dependencies that reinforced French influence. When African countries expelled French military forces, these economic relationships became vulnerable. France faced losing not just military bases but the entire network of economic advantages that military presence had secured. The United States had fewer direct economic stakes in the Sahel than France, but significant strategic interests. American military bases and intelligence facilities across Africa supported counterterrorism operations, monitored regional threats, and provided positioning for potential operations in multiple theaters. The sprawling American drone base in Niger represented hundreds of millions in investment and generated intelligence on militant groups across North and West Africa. Losing access to these facilities due to coups and Wagner partnerships meant losing capabilities that would be expensive and time-consuming to replicate elsewhere. American military planners watched Wagner's expansion with alarm because it directly threatened American strategic infrastructure across the continent. Some Western officials argued for cutting ties with military governments that expelled Western forces and invited Wagner. Stop all aid, impose sanctions, isolate them internationally until they reversed course. This hardline approach had advocates in foreign ministries and legislatures who believed that accommodating military coups and Wagner presence would encourage more coups and more Russian expansion. If there were no consequences for expelling Western forces, other African countries would follow the same path. Western powers needed to demonstrate that rejecting Western partnership carried costs that outweighed benefits of Russian alternatives. The sanctions advocates pushed for comprehensive measures: cut all military and security assistance, suspend economic aid except humanitarian, impose travel bans on coup leaders and their associates, freeze assets in Western financial systems, block access to international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, and coordinate European Union and American sanctions for maximum impact. The goal was making military governments so economically isolated and politically ostracized that they would be forced to choose between reversing coups, expelling Wagner, and restoring Western partnerships, or facing continued deterioration. But this approach risked pushing these countries completely into Russian and Chinese orbits while abandoning African populations who would suffer from isolation. Comprehensive sanctions would harm ordinary citizens more than military leaders, who could insulate themselves through resource extraction revenues and alternative partnerships. Cutting humanitarian aid would mean that health programs, food assistance, and development projects serving vulnerable populations would end, creating humanitarian crises. Isolating Sahelian countries would leave populations suffering from jihadist violence without any external support, potentially worsening security situations and creating more refugee flows that would ultimately affect European countries. The hardline approach also assumed that economic pressure would change military governments' calculations, but recent history suggested otherwise. When similar pressure had been applied to other African military governments, they typically doubled down on their positions rather than capitulating. Military leaders who had seized power and expelled foreign forces couldn't easily reverse those decisions without appearing weak and losing domestic support. The coups were popular in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger precisely because populations resented French presence and welcomed its end. Governments that brought French forces back after expelling them would face domestic political crises that could threaten their survival more than Western sanctions did. Other Western officials advocated continued engagement despite disagreements, maintaining contact and assistance to preserve some influence and demonstrate that democratic partners offered better long-term support than Russian mercenaries. This engagement approach had advocates among development professionals and some diplomats who argued that cutting all ties would be counterproductive. Maintaining relationships, even strained ones, kept channels of communication open. Continuing some assistance demonstrated that Western partners cared about African populations even when disagreeing with their governments. Preserving minimal cooperation created opportunities to shape situations and potentially facilitate transitions back toward democracy and Western partnership when circumstances changed. The engagement advocates argued for nuanced responses. Suspend military cooperation with coup governments but maintain humanitarian and development aid for populations. Impose targeted sanctions on individual coup leaders but avoid comprehensive economic isolation. Continue diplomatic engagement while clearly expressing disagreement with coups and Wagner partnerships. Maintain support for civil society and democratic forces even when governments were authoritarian. And prepare for eventual transitions by preserving relationships that could be rebuilt when political situations changed. This approach risked appearing to accept and normalize military coups and Wagner presence. If Western powers continued providing aid and maintaining relations with governments that had overthrown democratic systems and invited Russian mercenaries, what message did that send about Western commitment to democracy and opposition to Russian expansion? Other African countries observing Western responses might conclude that coups carried few real consequences if Western aid continued and diplomatic relations persisted. Authoritarian governments elsewhere might calculate that inviting Wagner wouldn't cost them Western support if Sahelian examples demonstrated that Western threats were hollow. The engagement approach also faced domestic political opposition in Western countries. European and American voters questioned why their governments continued aiding countries that had expelled Western forces and partnered with Russia. Opposition politicians attacked engagement as weak responses that failed to defend Western interests or punish anti-Western actions. Media coverage portrayed continued aid as rewarding bad behavior. The political pressure pushed Western governments toward harsher responses, even when officials privately believed engagement made more strategic sense. Western powers ultimately pursued inconsistent middle approach, condemning military coups and Wagner presence while maintaining some relations and assistance. They cut military cooperation but continued some humanitarian aid. They imposed targeted sanctions on military leaders but didn't pursue comprehensive economic isolation. They criticized Wagner operations but didn't take direct action to counter Russian influence. The approach satisfied no one and achieved little. African military governments dismissed Western criticism while benefiting from continued aid. Russia expanded presence while Western powers debated ineffectual responses. The inconsistency undermined Western credibility and effectiveness. When Western governments condemned coups but continued aid, African leaders interpreted the mixed signals as indicating Western opposition was rhetorical rather than serious. When sanctions targeted individual leaders but didn't comprehensively isolate countries, the economic pressure was insufficient to change calculations. When Western criticism of Wagner was harsh, but Western actions to counter Russian influence were minimal, Russia concluded that Western powers wouldn't effectively resist Russian expansion in Africa. The middle approach achieved the worst of both hardline and engagement strategies without the benefits of either. France's response was particularly tortured because France had most at stake. Losing military presence across the Sahel represented strategic defeat that undermined France's position as major power and its influence across Francophone Africa. French officials couldn't simply accept the expulsions without response, but French options were limited. France couldn't militarily reverse the coups without appearing as neo-colonial aggressor. France couldn't economically isolate Sahelian countries without harming French companies and cutting itself off from resources France needed. France couldn't maintain the fiction that French military presence was welcomed partnership when governments were expelling French forces and populations were celebrating French departure. French President Emmanuel Macron publicly declared that France would no longer be held hostage by African military governments and would redefine French presence in Africa. The rhetoric suggested fundamental rethinking of French approach, but actual policy changes were modest. France withdrew some troops from contested areas, but maintained military presence elsewhere in Africa. France reduced some aid but continued other programs. France criticized military governments and Wagner but didn't comprehensively break relations. The transformation of French Africa policy looked more like damage control than strategic realignment. French domestic politics complicated responses further. Right-wing French politicians criticized Macron for losing French influence in Africa and demanded harsher responses to countries expelling French forces. Left-wing politicians accused French policy of continuing neo-colonial patterns that created the resentment fueling anti-French sentiment. French military leaders watched decades of investment in African partnerships collapse and advocated maintaining whatever presence remained. French business interests wanted government support for protecting their economic position, even as military presence that had protected them disappeared. Macron faced contradictory domestic pressures that made coherent Africa strategy politically difficult. The United States faced similar contradictions but from different position. America had less historical baggage than France in West Africa, but also less leverage. American military assistance programs had been significant but less than French presence. American drone base in Niger was strategically important but not existential to American global positioning. America could more easily accept reduced presence in the Sahel than France could because American interests were less concentrated there. But American officials worried about broader implications of Wagner expansion and Russian influence replacing American partnerships across Africa. American policy oscillated between competing impulses. Some American officials wanted aggressive responses to counter Russian expansion, viewing Wagner's presence as zero-sum competition where Russian gains meant American losses. Others advocated strategic patience, accepting reduced presence in Sahel, while maintaining focus on more strategically important African regions. Treasury Department pushed for strong sanctions against Wagner and individuals facilitating Russian presence. Defense Department wanted maintaining whatever military relationships possible to preserve intelligence access and positioning. State Department sought diplomatic engagement to preserve influence and facilitate eventual democratic transitions. The interagency disagreements within American government produced incoherent policy that shifted based on which officials had the president's attention at any given time. Sanctions were announced, but implementation was inconsistent. Military assistance was suspended, but exceptions were granted. Diplomatic engagement continued, but high-level visits were canceled. The mixed signals confused African partners, encouraged African military governments to test American resolve, and allowed Russia to expand while America debated responses. European Union countries faced collective action problems that complicated responses. France wanted strong EU support for pressuring countries that expelled French forces. Other EU members had less stake in Sahelian security and were reluctant to jeopardize their own African relationships to support French interests. Germany, Italy, Spain, and others had development programs and economic ties they wanted to preserve, regardless of French strategic concerns. EU consensus on sanctions and aid suspension was difficult to achieve because member states had divergent interests and approaches. The lack of EU unity undermined whatever pressure Western powers could apply. When some EU countries maintained aid and relations while others imposed sanctions, African governments simply shifted engagement toward more accommodating partners within EU. When European development banks continued lending while some bilateral programs were suspended, the economic impact was minimal. African military governments learned to play European divisions against each other, accepting consequences from some countries while maintaining benefits from others. By early 2024, Wagner's presence across the Sahel was solidifying despite inconsistent Western responses. An estimated 1,000 to 1,500 Wagner fighters operated across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Central African Republic. They were conducting combat operations, training local forces, gathering intelligence, and securing resource extraction operations. Wagner had become a permanent feature of African security landscape, not temporary deployment that Western pressure would end. The permanence of Wagner presence demonstrated that Western responses had failed to achieve their objectives, regardless of whether those objectives were reversing coups, expelling Russian forces, or maintaining Western influence. Military governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had consolidated power rather than facing overwhelming pressure for democratic transitions. Wagner operations had expanded rather than contracting under sanctions threat. Russian influence had grown rather than being contained by Western competition. The strategic defeat for Western powers was comprehensive and undeniable. Western intelligence agencies documented Wagner's operations and impacts across the Sahel in detail. They tracked Wagner units conducting operations against jihadist forces, but also committing massacres of civilians accused of supporting insurgents. They monitored Wagner advisors embedded with African militaries, training them in brutal counterinsurgency tactics. They observed Wagner securing gold mining operations and extracting resources worth hundreds of millions annually. They identified Russian intelligence officers operating alongside Wagner, building networks across the region. The intelligence painted a clear picture of Wagner's role but didn't provide obvious policy options for countering it. Western military commanders watched Wagner operations with professional interest mixed with frustration. Wagner fighters were experienced combat veterans who fought effectively despite brutal methods. They used combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. They employed drones for intelligence and targeting. They maintained disciplined logistics and communications. Wagner was professional military force, not ragtag mercenaries, which explained their operational effectiveness. But their willingness to ignore rules of engagement, commit atrocities, and accept massive civilian casualties in pursuit of military objectives meant Western forces couldn't match their approach even if they wanted to. Some Western military officers privately acknowledged that Wagner's brutal effectiveness exposed contradictions in Western counterinsurgency approaches. Western forces operating under restrictive rules of engagement and careful proportionality requirements hadn't defeated Sahelian insurgencies despite superior equipment and training. Wagner forces operating with minimal constraints and maximum violence were achieving tactical successes that Western forces hadn't. This didn't mean Western approaches were wrong or that Wagner methods should be emulated. It meant that Western counterinsurgency doctrine developed for wars like Iraq and Afghanistan with massive resource advantages and long-term commitments didn't work well for African partners with limited capabilities and political will. The assassination of Wagner founder Yevgeny Prigozhin in August 2023, following his brief mutiny against Russian military leadership, created temporary uncertainty about Wagner's future that Western intelligence watched closely. Prigozhin had built and led Wagner for years, creating personal relationships with African leaders and managing the business operations that funded Wagner activities. His death raised questions about whether Wagner operations would continue and under whose control. Would Wagner collapse without Prigozhin's leadership? Would Russian government fully integrate Wagner into official military structures? Would African governments reconsider their Wagner partnerships if the organization changed fundamentally? The uncertainty lasted weeks as Western analysts assessed the situation and African governments waited to see what emerged. Some Western officials hoped Prigozhin's death would provide opportunity to peel African countries away from Russian partnerships while Wagner's future was uncertain. American and European diplomats approached African governments, suggesting this was a moment to reconsider relationships with Russian mercenaries whose organizational structure was in flux. The diplomatic outreach achieved nothing. African military governments had decided their interests aligned with Russian partnership regardless of specific organizational details. They waited to see what replaced Wagner rather than rushing back to Western partnerships that had failed them. It became clear within weeks that Wagner's African operations would continue under Russian military control through an organization called Africa Corps. Russian Ministry of Defense announced it was consolidating various irregular military units, including Wagner, into integrated command structure. For African operations, this meant Wagner forces would be reorganized as Africa Corps units under direct Russian military authority. The fighters were largely the same personnel. The operations would continue, and the resource extraction arrangements remained in place. The transition formalized what had always been true but had been obscured by Wagner's private company fiction. The transition from Wagner to Africa Corps formalized what had always been true. These forces operated with Russian government approval and support. The fiction of Wagner as independent private military company had been useful for providing deniability and avoiding accountability. Wagner abuses couldn't be attributed to Russian government officially since Wagner was supposedly private company. Wagner casualties didn't appear in Russian military death tolls since they were contractors, not soldiers. Wagner operations that failed or proved embarrassing could be disowned as actions of private actors, not Russian policy. But Prigozhin's mutiny and death made the fiction unsustainable. The mutiny revealed Prigozhin had been competing with Russian military leadership for Putin's favor and resources. His death in suspicious plane crash shortly after the mutiny demonstrated Putin had eliminated rival rather than tolerating alternative power center. Continuing to pretend Wagner was independent private company after the Russian government had clearly eliminated its founder for challenging Kremlin control was absurd. Russia simply acknowledged that Afrika Korps was state-directed force conducting operations that served Russian interests in Africa. For me and other African leaders working with these forces, the transition made little practical difference. The fighters were the same, the operations continued, and the resource extraction arrangements remained in place. The Wagner fighters I had met and worked with simply became Afrika Korps personnel with same mission and methods. The gold mining concessions Russian companies had received remained valid. The bases Wagner had established became Afrika Korps facilities. The only significant change was dropping pretense that these forces were private contractors rather than Russian government assets. That clarification actually improved the situation from my perspective because it meant Russian states stood behind commitments rather than potentially unreliable private company. Western intelligence agencies tracking the transition noted that Afrika Korps initially operated with lower profile than Wagner had. The fighters wore fewer identifying insignias and conducted operations with less public visibility. Russian government seemed intent on reducing international attention to its mercenary operations while continuing them substantively. But the lower profile didn't mean reduced operations. Afrika Korps maintained Wagner's operational tempo and brutal methods while being slightly less visible internationally. The Afrika Korps structure integrated Wagner's African operations with broader Russian military strategy more effectively than Wagner's quasi-independence had allowed. Afrika Korps commanders coordinated with Russian Ministry of Defense on strategic priorities, rather than making decisions based primarily on Prigozhin's business interests. Russian intelligence services had more direct access to intelligence Afrika Korps gathered, rather than relying on Wagner sharing information. Russian diplomatic efforts could be synchronized with Afrika Korps operations, rather than sometimes working at cross purposes when Prigozhin pursued separate agenda. The secret deal I made to replace French troops with Russian mercenaries achieved exactly what I intended. French military presence in Burkina Faso ended after decades. Wagner forces provided aggressive military support against jihadists without governance conditions or lectures about democracy. Burkina Faso demonstrated independence from France and Western powers. I consolidated political power domestically by delivering on anti-French nationalism. Russia gained strategic foothold in West Africa and access to valuable gold resources. The achievement was undeniable regardless of anyone's judgment about whether it was wise or moral. I had promised to end French military presence, and I delivered. I had promised to fight jihadists more aggressively than French forces had, and Wagner's operations were certainly more aggressive. I had promised to restore Burkina Faso's sovereignty and independence from former colonial power, and replacing French troops with Russian mercenaries demonstrated that sovereignty. My political position was stronger because I had delivered on commitments while my opponents could only criticize without offering alternatives that would have been more effective. Did the deal serve ordinary Burkinabe citizens' interests? That's more complicated. Security didn't dramatically improve despite Wagner's brutal methods. Human rights abuses increased under Wagner operations and Burkinabe forces trained by them. Gold resources that could benefit Burkinabe population were being extracted by Russian companies. Wagner's presence made Burkina Faso more dependent on Russia, potentially trading one form of foreign dependence for another. The deal served my political interests and Russian geopolitical objectives more clearly than it served Burkinabe development and welfare. The security situation remained dire despite Wagner operations. Jihadist attacks continued across northern and eastern Burkina Faso. Hundreds of civilians were killed in militant raids on villages. Thousands more were displaced from their homes by violence. Large areas remained outside effective government control, despite Wagner and Burkinabe military efforts to secure them. The brutal tactics Wagner employed hadn't translated to strategic victory against insurgencies that were fueled by governance failures, ethnic tensions, and economic marginalization that military force alone couldn't resolve. Wagner's tactics sometimes made security worse rather than better. Mass killings of civilians accused of supporting jihadists created new grievances that insurgents exploited for recruitment. Villages caught between jihadist threats and Wagner brutality faced impossible situations where cooperation with any armed group meant potential death from another. The terrorization of civilian populations that Wagner practiced as counter-insurgency strategy alienated communities whose support was necessary for long-term security. Wagner could kill militants but couldn't build the governance and economic alternatives that would make populations choose government over insurgency. Human rights organizations documented extensive abuses by Wagner forces and Burkinabe troops trained by them. Human Rights Watch reported that Wagner and Burkinabe forces had massacred hundreds of civilians in operations across northern Burkina Faso during 2023 and 2024. Amnesty International documented systematic torture of detainees, extrajudicial executions, and sexual violence by forces operating under Wagner guidance. United Nations Human Rights Office expressed grave concern about deteriorating human rights situation and called for investigations into potential war crimes. I dismissed these human rights reports as Western propaganda designed to undermine African governments that rejected Western military presence. The timing of the reports, released after Burkina Faso expelled French forces, was suspicious and suggested political motivations. Western powers had tolerated and sometimes enabled human rights abuses by African forces when those forces were Western partners, but suddenly became concerned about abuses when African countries partnered with Russia instead. The selective outrage demonstrated that Western human rights advocacy was a tool of foreign policy rather than principled commitment to protecting civilians. But independent African observers, civil society organizations, and affected communities told similar stories about Wagner and Africa Corps operations. Burkinabe human rights groups documented cases where Wagner forces had killed civilians, looted property, and committed abuses with impunity. Internally displaced persons fleeing violence reported attacks by both jihadists and government-aligned forces. Religious leaders and traditional authorities spoke about climate of fear created by indiscriminate violence from all armed actors. The human rights concerns weren't just Western propaganda, they were real experiences of Burkinabe populations suffering from brutal counterinsurgency methods. The gold resources Russia extracted through Wagner and Africa Corps operations represented lost opportunity for Burkina Faso's development. The mining concessions I had granted generated estimated $200 million annually in revenue for Russian companies. That wealth could have funded schools, hospitals, roads, and economic development programs that Burkina Faso desperately needed. Instead, it flowed to Russia as payment for security services that hadn't dramatically improved security situation. The exchange was unfavorable in economic terms, even if it served political and strategic objectives of ending French presence. Wagner and Africa Corps presence made Burkina Faso more dependent on Russia in ways that constrained future options. Once Russian forces were embedded in our security operations, gold resources were contracted to Russian companies, and basing agreements gave Russia presence on our soil. Extricating from the relationship would be difficult even if circumstances changed. Russia had leverage through its military presence and economic ties that could be used to pressure Burkina Faso into supporting Russian interests internationally and limiting Burkina Faso's freedom to pursue alternative partnerships. But I would make the same choice again because the alternatives were worse. Continuing with French security partnership meant accepting permanent subordination to former colonial power that had exploited Burkina Faso for over a century. French forces had failed to stop jihadist violence despite years of operations while maintaining bases and influence that served French interests. Breaking from France and partnering with Russia sent message throughout Africa that Western military dominance could be challenged and alternatives existed. The strategic calculation favored accepting Russian partnership with all its flaws over maintaining French relationship with all its history. French exploitation had lasted over a century and showed no signs of ending through continued partnership. French security assistance had been ineffective at addressing jihadist threats while being effective at maintaining French influence. Russian exploitation would be different in character but potentially limited in duration if Burkina Faso could eventually develop enough military capability to not need external security partners. The sovereignty gained by expelling France was worth the risks of Russian partnership. The domestic political benefits of expelling French forces and partnering with Russia were substantial for my government's stability. The anti-French nationalism I had tapped into to justify the expulsion was genuinely popular among Burkinabe population. People celebrated French departure and welcomed Russian presence as symbol of independence from former colonial power. My political opponents couldn't effectively deal with Russia without appearing to defend French presence that population rejected. The nationalism surrounding sovereignty and independence from Western influence provided political capital I used to consolidate power and suppress dissent. The transformation across the Sahel demonstrated that African countries possess agency to choose security partners and reject Western presence. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled French forces within 2 years, ending French military dominance in region France had controlled since colonial era. We replaced Western troops with Russian mercenaries who don't pretend to respect sovereignty while exploiting resources. The Russian partnership is transactional and exploitative in its own ways, but it's honest exploitation rather than exploitation disguised as aid and partnership. The honesty of Russian exploitation was preferable to French hypocrisy because it clarified the relationship. Russia wanted gold, strategic positioning, and political alignment. We wanted military support, equipment, and training. The exchange was clear, and both sides understood terms. French relationship had been obscured by rhetoric about partnership, development, and shared values, while France extracted resources, maintained political interference, and protected French economic interests. The gap between French rhetoric and French behavior created resentment that fueled anti-French sentiment. Russian transactional approach avoided that resentment by being honest about self-interest, motivating the relationship. Western powers are learning difficult lesson. African countries are no longer client states that automatically accept Western military presence and political influence. We have alternatives now. China offers economic investment and infrastructure without governance conditions. Russia provides military support and resource extraction deals without democracy requirements. Gulf states supply aid and partnerships without Western moralizing. Turkey, India, and others offer additional options. The monopoly on partnership that Western powers enjoyed is broken permanently. The multipolar environment creates negotiating leverage for African countries that didn't exist when Western powers were only option. When France threatened to reduce aid if we expelled French forces, I negotiated with Russia for alternative. When United States warned about consequences of Wagner partnership, I discussed enhanced cooperation with China. When Western powers collectively pressured me, I coordinated responses with other African governments facing similar pressure. The alternatives available meant Western threats carried less weight because we weren't desperate for Western support as only option. The leverage manifested in concrete policy changes where African countries successfully played competing powers against each other. When Western donors threatened aid cuts, we secured Chinese loans for infrastructure projects. When Western military assistance was suspended, Russian equipment and training filled gap. When Western companies reduced investment due to political pressure from their governments, Chinese and Russian companies increased presence. The competition between Western powers, China, Russia, and others, created space for African agency that hadn't existed when West was only viable partner. France's response to losing military presence across the Sahel has been bitter recrimination and warnings about consequences. French officials claim that countries expelling French forces will face increased instability and jihadist violence. They predict that Russian partnerships will lead to resource exploitation and authoritarian governance. They warn that African populations will suffer from choosing Russian mercenaries over French troops. All of these French predictions may prove accurate, but they miss the point. African countries are choosing to take those risks rather than accept continued French dominance. The French warnings about security consequences rang particularly hollow because French military presence hadn't prevented increased instability and jihadist violence. French forces had operated in Mali since 2013 and Burkina Faso since 2010 without defeating insurgencies that grew stronger despite French operations. French claims that their departure would cause security catastrophe ignored that security situations had already deteriorated to catastrophic levels while French forces were present. The threat that things would get worse without French presence wasn't compelling when French presence hadn't prevented things from getting terrible. French predictions about Russian exploitation similarly lacked credibility given French history. France had extracted African resources for over a century through colonial rule and post-independence arrangements that maintained French economic dominance. French companies controlled vast sectors of African economies and repatriated profits to France. The CFA franc system forced African countries to deposit reserves in French treasury and tie monetary policies to French interests. French warnings that Russia would exploit African resources were hypocritical, coming from power that had been exploiting those same resources systematically for generations. French concerns about authoritarianism under Russian partnership ignored France's own history, supporting African dictators. France had backed authoritarian regimes across Francophone Africa throughout post-independence period when those regimes protected French interests. French military interventions had sometimes defended authoritarian governments against democratic opposition. French economic support had enriched dictators while populations remained impoverished. French moralizing about democracy and human rights was undermined by decades of prioritizing French interests over African governance. The preference for Russian partnership with all its flaws over French partnership with all its history reveals how much resentment France has built through decades of neocolonial interference. The resentment wasn't irrational anti-French prejudice. It was rational response to objective history of French behavior toward Africa. France had never truly accepted that its African colonies were independent sovereign nations rather than French sphere of influence. French interference in African politics, economics, and security continued long after formal decolonization. The accumulated resentment from this interference meant African populations and governments preferred breaking with France even if alternatives like Russia had serious problems.